Hello and good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on this live stream with a very special guest speaker. His name is Elijah Jamal Balbed, and he is here with us today to share his experience as an artist and as an entrepreneur. Elijah, thank you for being with us today. We're looking forward to your talk and what you have to share with our audience. I would like to remind our viewers that you can submit your questions in all of our social media channels, and Elijah will address them during our Q&A session. Elijah, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Matilda, and everybody for having me. And wherever you may be tuning in from, thanks for tuning in. Special greetings to my friends in Russia. I was fortunate to perform in Russia 2018 and 2019 with two amazing groups of musicians from the Washington, D.C. area. And we had such a ball out there, and we miss you all dearly. Be here to chat with you all about art and entrepreneurship as a musician. When I was thinking about what to discuss in this presentation, I felt it would just kind of be best to go through points of my career and go over some of the lessons I've learned and the experiences I've had that have led to where I'm at today, which is that of a full-time musician, multi-instrumentalist, as you see a few different instruments behind me, an educator, a composer, an arranger, and even diving into curating, presenting music myself. I don't want to bore you with my my first gig with a professional band. I was 14 years old, and I had started playing the saxophone at 11. I didn't grow up in a musical household in particular, but I did in the respect that my mom was a huge music fanatic. She played when she was in high school. She went to Duke Ellington School for the Arts and played classical percussion, and didn't continue with music professionally, but always loved good music. She worked at jazz clubs when she was in her adulthood. And she surrounded me with instruments. I had a mini harmonica that I apparently used to compose songs on when I was a kid, little percussion instruments and xylophone, things like that. And then when it was time to pick up a band instrument, I knew I wanted to play a horn of some sort, and we landed on saxophone. So fast forward a few years, by the time I got to high school, I was in love with music. And I was fortunate to be surrounded with great teachers and mentors in high school, college, and even into adulthood and now. In high school, I had a great band director at Einstein High School in Maryland, Miss Joan Racky. And in college, I continued to Howard University, where I studied with the great Charlie Young. And so I'm in high school, and as I mentioned, I was starting to fall in love with jazz. I listened to everything from Joe Henderson, John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, and of course, Charlie Parker. And I really fell in love with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. I listened to a lot of Art Blakey, as you can see. And then from there, I kind of dived into more modern music like Dave Holland, Kenny Garrett, Chris Potter, Joshua Redman, and groups like Medeski, Martin and Wood, The Bad Plus, RH Factor, and so forth. And at this point, I was practicing all the time as well. Okay. So as I mentioned, I started gigging pretty early, and how I transitioned from being just a kid practicing the horn to somebody working and getting paid to play music was in large part thanks to my teacher in high school, Paul Carr, who subbed out a gig to me when he couldn't make it. Again, I was 14 years old, and when I showed up, the band looked at me like, what is this kid doing here? What is he going to do? Like, skeptical. And I didn't know what I was doing there either, but I guess Paul trusted in me to not only deliver musically, but have a decent enough work ethic to be able to get through the gig. And One of the guys that was on that gig I still play with to this day, and he jokes that by the end of the gig, it didn't matter that I was 14 years old. Also around the same time, I started working at a music store. And that's something as an artist, oftentimes we have to end up finding different ways to supplement the art. And so early on, I was fortunate to be in a music environment, even outside of playing gigs, working at Dale Music in Silver Spring, Maryland. So before I was even of age, really, I had 2 jobs and I was already starting to make money as a musician. So I was an entrepreneur before I even knew it. While in high school, I started to venture into the city. I grew up just outside the city in Silver Spring, Maryland. So I went into Washington, DC to start sitting in with professional musicians, bands playing on U Street, and jam sessions that were happening around town. Little by little, I found myself starting to develop a reputation around town and would meet musicians every time I went to jam sessions or went to other people's gigs, and started to get called for work myself. My teacher in college said, you always have to know your worth, because when you're starting out, you're going to have to do things that might pay less, or in some cases maybe not pay, to get your name out there and to get some exposure. But as you develop and you build your reputation, you want to know when it's time to stop taking those, lesser paid opportunities. He used to say, once you stop taking 50 gigs, you start getting called for $100 gigs. Once you stop taking $100 gigs, you start getting called for $200 gigs, so forth. So as you build your reputation and you build your resume, you can kind of gauge what you think is your worth, and it's important to know that. And I always tell my students in music in particular, your reputation is your resume. Your reputation is your resume. Forgive me, I'm just checking a few notes here. Okay, so one thing that benefited me was I started gigging in Washington, D.C. and then I stayed in the same city for college, for university. I went to Howard University. And that was a really great experience, because while at Howard, I got to start performing, recording. We even traveled to Tokyo, Japan, and performed. And also got to stay in the DC area and continue building my reputation and continue the momentum that I had already started before university. We also got to perform with a host of legendary musicians, including Larry Willis, Benny Maupin, and somebody who we just recently lost, the legendary saxophone player, Pharoah Sanders. That was, I guess, 19 or 20-year-old me performing Pharoah Sanders' song, "The Creator Has a Master Plan," while Pharoah watched. I was a little bit nervous. So yeah, just a lot of great experiences at Howard University. And again, that's where I really started to build my reputation around town, and become known as a good side person. And I think that is something that can translate to different professions and different fields. Just being a reliable worker, being a strong side person, somebody that can show up, do the job, not outshine the person that's, the lead, but also give them enough support to make them sound as good as possible. I really believe when you develop those skills as a side person, it trains you to be a better band leader. A big part of that is witnessing how great band leaders operate, how they do their business. And when I started to play around town, one of the first really groundbreaking major artists that I got to start performing with, I was 21 years old, and I got a call to fill in with the late great godfather of go-go, Chuck Brown. That's Chuck. And that picture was taken by a friend of the band's and a friend of mine, Chip Pye, who also put out a book of pictures from Chuck Brown's last 10 years. And I was featured in that book as well. But yeah, Chuck always carried himself with class. He commanded a certain level of respect, and he always made sure his musicians were taken care of. And those are all traits that I learned from Chuck, and I try to keep going when I lead my own gigs and run my own band. He was really beloved all across Washington, D.C. and abroad in some countries. And I have a clip of actually the very last gig I did with Chuck Brown. This was in Richmond, Virginia, in February of 2012, just before his passing the following May. That was Chuck Brown, the godfather of go-go. And go-go music is known around the country, but it largely is popular in Washington, D.C. and the surrounding regions. And one of the times we went to Russia, we brought some go-go music out there, and it was a blast. So yeah, the point is, being a good sideman, again, will just really set you up for being a good leader. Oftentimes, being a side person, the music is kind of the easier part. It's the fun part. To me, what you really get noticed for and really get called back for are things like showing up on time, being prepared, paying attention to the details, reading that email that the band leader sends out ahead of time, being dressed well, looking good, having a good vibe. All those things, I think, contribute to having a better reputation and getting called back for gigs and getting called for better gigs. Okay. So I was playing with Chuck Brown and started to play around town with other bands and artists as well, and freelancing, all still while in college. And I had a mentor who passed away in 2019. His name was Fred Foss, and he was a great sax player who played with Ray Charles and Tito Puente and Lionel Hampton and Hugh Masekela. The list goes on. And I was so grateful for our friendship and relationship before he passed away, because he always instilled little gems within me. And one thing he always would say, he said it so many times throughout the years that we knew each other, was to, as an artist, always increase your streams of income. So already I have the music store, which in college I stopped working at because I started getting more gigs. Gigs with Chuck Brown, gigs with a few agency bands, starting to lead a few, jazz gigs around town under my own name, things like that. Each different band you play with, each different outlet you have, in a way, is a different stream of income. So the more streams of income you have, the more you're setting yourself up for a better life in the arts and in music. Okay. So that was sort of the era in my life when I was developing those skills, how to be a good side person, oftentimes making some mistakes along the way, and sometimes learning the hard way. Another really great tool and resource we have in the DC area, and you might have in your respective areas, are residencies. I've been fortunate to do a bunch of different artist residencies in a various amount of different fields. The first notable one that comes to mind was in 2013, the Betty Carter Jazz Ahead program. And as a young jazz musician and composer, that was an incomparable experience where I got to work with teachers like Mark Carey and Dwayne Burno, rest in peace, and the great drummer Nate Smith, Craig Handy, and of course Jason Moran, who runs the program. And we got to perform at the Kennedy Center, all of our original material, all like-minded musicians around the same age. And some of those musicians ended up being rising stars in our field, like Jasmia Horn and Michael Mayo, great vocalists, and my good friend Curtis Noasad, who's a drummer, getting around all over the place. And then I also, the following year, I auditioned for and got into the Strathmore Artists in Residence program. And these residencies and these artist development programs, I think, were beneficial for me to help transition in a way from being a side person to more of a leader. Sometimes as artists, we have these ideas and we have a vision and we have something that we think might be cool, but we don't always have the platform or the resources to execute it. So this was 2014. At this point, Chuck Brown had been gone a couple years, and there had been some thoughts lingering in my mind about how I could bring my love for jazz music and my experience playing go-go together. So during my Strathmore residency, I debuted my jazz and go-go fusion band. This was 2004, was the culminating concert of my Strathmore residency, and we have a clip from that as well. This is the Jogo Project. That was fun to watch. I was 24 years old in that video. Now I'm 33. A few facial hairs ago. And that performance featured a few incredible local musicians who are only local because they live in the area, but they're really internationally known. The vocalist I went to Howard with, her name is Christy Dashiell. And as I mentioned, just amazing, travels all around the world, performs with people like Marcus Strickland, and just one of the finest vocalists in the area. And on the trombone, gentleman is an important figure in my life because he's a big reason why I got to play with Chuck Brown to begin with. And he's just a local legend in his own right, the trombone player, Greg Boyer. You've probably seen him. If you haven't, you've definitely heard him. He's an original member of Parliament Funkadelic, then went on with Chuck Brown, toured with Prince, Maceo Parker, P-Funk, all P-Funk, even to this day. Okay. Some older musicians, when I was younger, I used to hear this all actually. It's all about who you know in the music business. There are a lot of great players, but if you make the right connections and you are genuinely nice to people, genuinely and generally decent to other people, that'll go a long way in the music business. There are plenty of good players that just can't show up, you know. But just a little bit more about we got to know each other better playing in the Bohemian Caverns Jazz Orchestra. And in 2011, Chuck Brown sax player Brian Mills started getting busy with his own band, Secret Society, and started missing some gigs with Chuck, and they needed somebody to jump in there, as I mentioned earlier. Greg and Brad Clement, they both suggested that they give 21-year-old Elijah Balbed a shot. But also, Brian had already heard of me through some other circles. And another drummer in town, Robert Mousy Thompson, who actually used to play with James Brown, was sort of in the mix, and he also suggested me. So going back to it's who you know and that helping your career, it would have been one thing if I got recommended by one person and nobody else had ever heard of me, and that'd be kind of like obscure, like I don't know if we should give that guy a shot. But because I was recommended by really three different groups of people or three different people, I think that's in large part what gave me that opportunity, or that just helped seal the deal when they were considering somebody to take over the sax seat with Chuck. All right. And knowing Greg led to so many other opportunities. The first gig after Chuck that Greg called me for was another musician who is no longer with us, and I only got to play with him one time before he passed away, the great keyboardist George Duke. It was more or less somewhat of a private event, corporate kind of thing, but the opportunity to share the stage with one of the legendary funk and R&B artists and keyboard players of our time was really just incredible. And from then on, Greg hired me to do the Capitol Jazz Cruise, where we were the house band with Spur of the Moment, and we got to play behind Layla Hathaway, Raheem Devon, Eric Roberson, Kirk Whalum, Jonathan Butler, and so many great, incredible artists. And it was on those cruises that I really got to know and develop a friendship with a guy named Mike Phillips, who's a great sax player that played with Prince, MJ, and Stevie Wonder. And him and Greg Boyer played with Prince together. And I work with Mike a lot in his band, in his horn section to this day. So that was a relationship that all really kind of blossomed from meeting Greg about 13 years ago now. Okay. In addition to being an incredible musician, Greg is also a wordsmith. He's just beautiful with descriptions and always has amazing ways of creating imagery to describe things. And so for those of you less familiar with go-go music, I'm going to let Greg do it for me because he did it so eloquently. And that'll be video 4.
It's just a lot of fun, but there's a lot more music involved than people think. They think, okay, it's just a drum beat. I say certain sections of a song are, but there's a whole lot that goes on to make that drum beat retain its feeling and not, become monotonous. We do things to make sure that it goes on and on and on. It's pretty much like coasting on a bicycle. Some point you're going to have to pedal a little bit to keep it going. And that's what we are. We're the pedals on a really big, funky bicycle.
Genius. We're the pedals on a really big, funky bicycle. Greg Boyer, ladies and gentlemen. That was a clip from a video we did actually with FCE earlier last year, promoting go-go music in the Netherlands. And that was the Transatlantic Music Project. And you'll be seeing more from that a little bit later in this at the end. All right. Okay. So that's Greg. I just had to talk about him a little bit because he really has been an example of knowing one person can actually change the trajectory of your career. And you just never know who that's going to be, when that's going to happen. So it's always good, as I mentioned earlier, your reputation is your resume. So it's always good to just always be trying to build on that and keeping a good reputation. Part of that is paying your dues. I went through many years of gigs where at the end I wouldn't necessarily be excited or jolly about what just happened. Sometimes it would be, some sort of agency gig where we weren't treated that well, or a band that I wasn't particularly excited to be playing with. I don't know. There's a host of reasons that can sometimes make you feel negatively at the end of a performance. And if you do enough of those gigs, it can actually phase out the opportunities that don't pay well, but also that don't pay well as far as happiness and feed your soul and make you feel good. It's a balance. But you always have to be kind of thinking about the long road in music. In this day and age of social media, instant gratification, it's harder and harder, I think, to be in the mindset of really paying your dues, taking the steps that are necessary to getting to where you want to be. Just waking up the next day and I'm verified, or I got 10,000 followers, or this many people like me, So I think, especially in the 21st century, if you're willing to put in the time, put in the work, it might not be tomorrow, it might not be next month, it might not be next year, but you got to keep chipping away at the ice until something breaks. That's the experience I've had. As I mentioned, working with other great artists, some of the industry people, the managers, booking agents that are surrounded by those scenes. And once you are ready to kind of lead, that's when you want to start thinking about the steps to take to establish your own brand, to create what it is you do and set yourself aside from the rest. When I started Jogo Project, I didn't realize it, but in a way that was me establishing a brand for myself. Because it was unique to my experience as a jazz musician who got pulled into the go-go scene. Okay. And leading a more niche project and a bigger band alone forced me to grow as an entrepreneur and as a business person, because I went from leading bands with 3 or 4 people and being responsible for paying 3 or 4 people to a band of 7, 8, sometimes 9 people, and the gig ends and you're responsible for paying 9 people. Just getting more organized with keeping records of things, writing things down. Again, 9 people, if we have 1 gig a month, sure, I can keep track of, who's paid and who's not. But as we've gotten busier, we've had 3 and 4 gigs in a month, and sometimes even upwards of 6 and 7. And last June, we had about 10 gigs in 1 month. And so 10 times 9, you do the math. That's a lot of people and payments to keep track of. Okay. So one thing that has helped me immensely with accounting and organization and the business side of keeping a band together are spreadsheets. And that'll be, yep, there we are. So this is just an example of some upcoming events, gigs that we have. And this is how I keep track of just a few of the basic details of the gig, like load in, sound check, budget, profit, who's on which gigs, because sometimes that is interchangeable. We have some members, that are more consistent than others. And then on the right, contract, invoice, payment, if that's all been sent, received, etc. And so just that, even small level of organization has helped me keep track of things and helped me be more on top of accounting. Okay. All right, so with our last few minutes, I'm just going to kind of talk about the 3 steps in my experience that I had to take, and I think would be beneficial for others to take note from, from having an idea, having a vision, to actually executing said idea and executing somewhat of a vision. Okay. So if you could pull up slide 6, this is the first step. Okay. You have to start with a vision or a concept. For me, that vision was knowing that I wanted to start a band that somehow combined my jazz influences and my go-go influences together. So lean into what it is that you do differently. Embrace what makes you unique and separates you from the next person in your field. So that was me leaning into the journey that I had, which was less orthodox than a lot of musicians. Write original music that reflects your lived experience, or arrange songs by other artists that inspire you but make it more personal. Arranging is something that can be really fun to do. If you take a song that you already know, already love, find a way to arrange it that reflects your style and your abilities. And then lastly, of course, come up with a name. For me, that was Jogo Project, Jazz and Go-Go, and a mission statement for your brand. All right. Step 2, this will be slide 7. Develop the concept, and establish your brand. So at this point, ideally, you've already mapped out some things in your head, and you have a vision and some ideas for a concept. The next step is to develop that concept and hone in on what it is more specifically that you do and have to offer. Assemble a team of people with the skill sets and personalities you see necessary to run a business. And just as a side note of that, the ability to hire the right people and assemble the right team is a skill set in itself. It takes a certain type of person to be able to combine a lot of different personalities and have it all mesh well. All right, site for said brand, and you can always hire somebody to do those things. And then step 3, perform, as well as trial and error. As you start to work more and take more performance opportunities, you'll pretty organically figure it out what works and what doesn't. Assemble a list of venues and festivals you want to perform at. A one-sheet EPK or something like that that quickly and easily demonstrates what you're offering is always helpful. Figure out which venues and opportunities are better suited for you and find similar ones, because especially when you're doing more of a niche brand or a niche project, it's harder to find the right spaces and harder to find the venues and audiences that fit your particular thing. And then, as I mentioned earlier, apply for residencies in your area. There are all kinds of songwriting competitions as well, and other ways that can help get your music out there in front of more people. And lastly, just as a general note, this will be slide 9, work hard and be cool. I said this a couple times throughout the presentation, but you have to be willing to work. You have to be willing to pay the dues. And having a solid work ethic, a positive mindset, and a good vibe will take you very far. Okay. We're just about out of time for the presentation, but before we go home, before we go into the Q&A rather, I did want to play a clip from the Transatlantic Music Project. This is the Jogo Project, featuring special guest Malik Dope, the drummer, video 6.
Oh yeah! This sound called Go-Go, y'all. It's brought to you by an all-star crew. Do what you do, come on!
So that is my band, just coming up on a decade of being in existence, the Jogo Project. All right, it is Q&A time, and we got some questions here. First question. As a renowned musician, you've achieved so much in the jazz scene. What would you say is your proudest moment or most memorable accomplishment so far in your career? Great question. Actually, it was not too long ago, one very big career highlight, and it was kind of a culmination of, as I mentioned earlier, just knowing the right people and having certain connections. It was a Wednesday midweek, and I got a call for a gig that following Friday to play with the famous R&B legendary singer, Miss Lauryn Hill. And I played with her at Wolf Trap Performing Arts Center in just outside of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. And it was just kind of another example of witnessing music, musicianship, artistry at a very high level. There were about 7 horn players, 7 strings, 4 keyboard players, the band. So a lot of musicians on stage, a lot of moving parts. It required ultimate focus from all the musicians. We all had to kind of just be patient, because even just getting that many musicians plugged in and sound checked, that alone took about an hour. So just being willing to and ready to operate on a high level, and being ready for those kind of opportunities is what leads to more opportunities like that. Can you share any experiences from your cultural diplomacy tours in Russia that particularly stand out? How have these experiences influenced your music or personal perspective? Great question. So yeah, as I mentioned, we had such a blast performing in Russia. One thing about go-go music is we have a lot of call and response. So the band will shout something out, the audience responds, shout something out, and so forth. Which is interesting when you're in a place where people don't speak the same language. But it was one of those perfect examples of how music is a universal language, because when you're just shouting out something that's more emotive and less of, I mean, it almost doesn't have to be the right word, but like we would just be like, hey, the audience goes, hey, hey is fairly universal. Oh. So when we did things like that, we were able to engage the Russians with call and response, even if it wasn't speaking, English in particular. Next question. You performed in various international venues and contexts. How do you think these experiences of cross-cultural music making have shaped your artistry? Well, I think it's in general. I think more people should do it if they get the opportunity. And it's one of the reasons that, well, not one of the reasons, but one inspiration and driving force for wanting to excel at a higher level musically, because knowing that those travel opportunities might come my way if I'm able to perform at a high level. But for one, learning little bits of new languages is exciting. Being able to take what we've learned and then come back to America and meet people of maybe that background and speak a few words here and there. Trying new foods. I love cultural foods. And depending on where you go, sometimes learning about the music of that particular culture, that also excites me. On a personal note, how do you stay inspired and motivated given the demands of your career? Are there certain rituals and routines that you maintain for your creativity and well-being? I like that one. So yeah, I think I have personally gone through phases of wearing myself out. I am a freelancer, but I also lead a couple bands. I also play in several other people's bands and organize a music series at a museum here in DC. So throughout the day, I'm constantly having to attend to a lot of different things. And it's funny because, people jokingly say, or sometimes not so jokingly, that music isn't a real job. I'm like, well, if you saw my day to day, you wouldn't say that. Oftentimes I have to wake up early, like this morning, and stay up late, like last night. Even just preparing for this presentation and getting ready for a few other events that I have this week. So one thing is listening to my body when I need rest and when it's telling me I need rest. Always listen to your body. I'm in my 30s, which is still young, but it's when your body starts to tell you things that when you're not treating it right. Eating, well, I'm constantly trying to improve my diet. The busier I get, sometimes the more prone I am to eating, fast food or just something that's convenient. So I try to be cognizant of that, always trying to get, fruits and vegetables and other healthy things in my system. And going to the pool. I love sitting by the pool or going in the water. Something about the water is just very meditative to me. And although I don't meditate on a regular basis, I do find different moments in my life to meditate and to try to relax and ground myself and get away from all the stresses of that current moment. You must have experienced periods of intense stress and pressure. How do you handle these challenges? And what strategies do you use to maintain a balance in your life? So I showed you all the spreadsheet that I used earlier, and that's one of actually several different spreadsheets that I use to kind of stay organized. Organization has been a work in progress for me, but the more organized I've become, the easier it is to balance and maintain my stress. And it's easier for me to just see things in my head when things are also laid out in spreadsheets. So yeah, that's also, that's physical organization, digital organization, all those things combined, I think, help me balance everything. Okay. Could you share some insights about jazz trends? How do you see the future of jazz music in your city? Well, Washington, D.C. in particular, cool jazz scene, actually. We have artists and R&B. We have artists like Duke Ellington, Marvin Gaye, Roberta Flack, Buck Hill, Butch Warren, a whole list of legendary musicians who were either born or spent a lot of time developing their artistry in the DC area. And that history kind of finds its way to stay alive throughout the different generations. When I was in college, U Street was still booming with jazz. There were either jazz clubs or venues almost every block actually, where you could hear music played by some of the best musicians in the city. Nowadays, at least in Washington, D.C., it's gotten more spread out. So there's like one spot on U Street, there are a couple spots in Adams Morgan, one spot or a couple in Mount Pleasant, one, uptown, a few downtown, Northern Virginia, Maryland, etc. So it's less. Also, DC has it being a historical go-go scene and having a history of great R&B and funk musicians, that bleeds into the jazz scene as well. So you have a lot of jazz fusion where musicians are still improvising in the spirit of jazz, but maybe in more of an R&B neo-soul fusion style. And there's a lot of different kind of subcategories within that as well. Okay, this is the last question I see, and we're almost out of time. So How do you approach songwriting and composition, and where do you draw your inspirations from? Oftentimes, my songs come from some place of either stress, pain, something I might be going through in my life, and once in a while, joyful moments and more positive things. But typically, I'll hear a bass line or some sort of chordal structure first, build a melody on top of that, and then try to develop it into more of a song. So I don't know if this will work, but one of my songs, I just started with a bass line. And then added chords. And little by little develop it into what it is. But usually the source of the inspiration is some events or some sort of thing that I've experienced or lived through. It's compositions are just another way to tell an artist's story. All right, and this will be the last one, I believe. What role does entrepreneurship play in your career as a musician? So I mentioned, and you got to see clips of my band, the Jogo Project. As I said, at points we've had months where we were working once or twice in a month. But this year we've had months where we have many gigs in a single month. And when you look at your taxes at the end of the year and you see that you're putting actual money into people's pockets, it makes you realize that this is more than a band, it's a business. So thinking of it more of it as a business has allowed me to grow the band in ways financially, pay the members of the band better, charge more, increase our rates, make sure the infrastructure is there, all of our things are in place so that we can succeed, but also keep working as much as possible. So even though I didn't study business in school, and that's another topic we would have to have for another day, because unfortunately a lot of music programs don't teach a lot of music business. Leading a band of 8 people has enabled me to know what it's like to run a small business, at least. All right, everybody. I hope that was informative, enjoyable, and I thank you all for tuning in and hanging out with me this afternoon. This has been a wonderful experience. I love what I do, and I love sharing the process with other people. So thank you all for joining me. Thanks to FCE and the American Center in Moscow for having me.